So this is our fifth webinar of the series on feminist economics, and it has for title CSO Advocacy towards IFIs, mandates, entry points, building coalitions, and developing contacts. So we know that the IFIs have enormous influence on fiscal policy and thus on gender equality, which is of great relevance to the work of women's rights movement. However, not all IFIs have gender equality, human rights, and social welfare in their mandates. So while they may be sympathetic to such concepts, it is not a key and integrated part of their work. And when they do work on gender mainstreaming or women's economic empowerment, they do so within an economic theory that does not allow them to grapple with root causes of inequality. However, there has been movement on this since the COVID pandemic hit, which provides with opening for advocacy. All IFIs have made statements toward the necessity of considering economic inequality and the impact of care work within a macroeconomic frame. It still remains to be seen how this will be implemented in practice. Civil society can play a role in forming these policies, but they need to be aware of how to engage, as IFIs are also typically difficult to engage with and to influence due to insufficient and transparent civil society engagement processes. This session will focus on three international financial institutions, the IMF, World Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, with a comparative presentation of their mandates, structures, and internal frameworks on gender and women's rights. The session will also present examples of how women's rights organizations can target their advocacy towards each of these institutions and present some of the NGO alliances that already are working on this in the MENA region. So as I said, we will start with Shereen Talaat from the Arab World Coalition. So, Rabib, I think there is a problem in the challenge. I can hear you on the off channel. Can you hear me? Shereen, are you here? I think Shereen is having also an internet problem, but I will introduce her until she gets back to us. So Shereen Talaat has been working for more than 17 years with different local communities around the MENA region as a filmmaker and a campaigner for social justice issues. In 2014, she became a part of a group with other researchers and civil society activists from Egypt, Yemen, Iraq, Jordan, and Tunisia, working together on IFI's policies and projects, especially the World Bank. After more than 4 years of reviewing policies, joining campaigns and engaging with the World Bank on local and regional level, she became one of the founders of the Arab Watch Coalition, which is a regional coalition. She also became its co-director. Shereen had her bachelor's degree from the Faculty of Education, English Department, Ain Shams University in Egypt. She had her master's degree from the Department of Educational Science, and environmental media of the same university. Then, in 2008, she graduated from the Academy of Cinema Art and Technology, where she studied filmmaking. She started a career as a video journalist with different leading news agencies such as the Associated Press and Thomson Reuters. The experience she has in media and campaigning gives her the opportunity to work as a consultant and a campaigner with different regional and international development and human rights organizations and networks. In addition to her work and passion as a documentary filmmaker and video journalist, who tries through her work to address and highlight topics related to social and economic justice. Shereen enjoys teaching and training, especially when working with local communities on developing creative campaigning tools. Shereen will speak in Arabic, so if you would like to listen to the English translation, please switch to the English channel by clicking on the globe on the bottom of the screen. So, Shereen, نعطيك الكلمة, and we are so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you سماح. شكرا جدا. أنا أسفة على المشاكل التقنية، مش بإيد حد. الإنترنت في المنطقة كلها، في منطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا وأكيد في مناطق مختلفة middle income countries زينا كده عندهم مشاكل في الإنترنت برضه. فأنا بعتذر للحضور وبعتذر للمنظمين، لكن أنا سعيدة أني هكون موجودة معاكم النهاردة. أرجوكم لو حد حاسس أني بتكلم بسرعة يقول في الشات، يعني أتكلم ببطء شوية. وبشكر المترجمين اللي موجودين معانا مقدما على المجهود اللي هيبذلوه. زي ما قالت سماح، أنا شيرين طلعت، المدير التنفيذي المشارك لتحالف أرب واتش. وتحالف أرب واتش هو تحالف إقليمي قوامه أعضاء، فعندنا أعضاء من منظمات المجتمع المدني المحلية حوالين المنطقة. بنشتغل في تونس والمغرب والعراق والأردن واليمن ولبنان ومصر. أنا حاليا مقيمة في المغرب. التحالف أرب واتش بيشتغل على مراقبة ومتابعة سياسات ومشاريع المؤسسات التمويلية الكبرى. أنا النهاردة هتكلم من غير أي برزنتيشن ولا باوربوينت ولا أي حاجة. أنا حاسة إن إحنا محتاجين نتناقش، نعمل ديسكشنز، وأتمنى في الأسئلة يعني أقدر أجاوب على كل ردودكم. ليه أنا مش هشتغل ببرزنتيشن ولا باوربوينت؟ علشان عايزة أوصل لكم إنه الملف ده مهم جدا، لكن كمان مش بالضرورة تبقى تقني أو متخصص أو ايكونومست أو يعني شخص بيشتغل في الاقتصاد أو أكاديمي علشان تقدر تشتغل عليه. فاهمة إنه لما نقول مؤسسات تمويلية كبرى زي البنك الدولي أو البيرد، بنك تنمية الإعمار الأوروبي، أو بنك الاستثمار الأوروبي EIB إلى آخره من المؤسسات، إضافة إلى صندوق النقد الدولي اللي عنده طبيعة خاصة، ويمكن الكلام هيجيبنا عن طبيعة واختلاف صندوق النقد عن بقية المؤسسات التمويلية الكبرى. يمكن لما نسمع الأسماء دي نحس إنه هنتكلم معاهم إزاي، دول تقنيين، وإحنا يا إما مؤسسات بتشتغل على الجندر وقضايا النساء، أو مؤسسات بتشتغل على البيئة مثلا، أو إلى آخره. فما لناش موقع هنتكلم معاهم إزاي، محتاجين مختصين. في الحقيقة لا، إحنا نقدر نقعد معاهم على الترابيزة وفقا للمنديتس أو الالتزامات اللي هم حاطينها لنفسهم كأصحاب حقوق. إحنا أصحاب حقوق طالما هم بينفذوا مشاريع وعندهم برامج في بلادنا وبيطبقوا سياسات في بلادنا، يبقى احنا اصحاب حقوق. هم بيقولوا علينا ستيك هولدرز، احنا بنقول رايت هولدرز، اصحاب حق. فنقدر نقعد على الترابيزه، مش بالضروره نبقى تقنيين. انا في الاصل مش تقنيه، انا في الاصل زي ما قالت سماح انا صانعه افلام. ومن هنا جه شغلي على مراقبه المؤسسات التمويليه الكبرى من بعد الثوره في مصر في 2011، لما كنا بنشتغل مع مجموعات على الارض في صعيد مصر وبندربهم يعني ايه حقوق اقتصاديه واجتماعيه، ويعني ايه صناعه فيلم وثائقي يقدر يتم استخدامه في الحملات. في الحقيقه من هنا جه التقاطع، لانه تقاطعنا مع بعض المشاريع اللي حصلت فيها تاثيرات مختلفه، وهذه المشاريع كانت مموله من المؤسسات التمويليه الكبرى. علشان كده قدرنا نشتبك، وبعدين عجبني الموضوع وكملت فيه لغايه ما احنا وزمايلنا اللي بداوا من سنين، يمكن من اكثر من 10 سنين، يشتغلوا على الملف ده في المنطقه، وكونا تحالف Arab Watch. أنا شايفة إن إيما زميلتي فاينلي كانت موجودة، وأفضل إن إيما تبدأ معاكم تتكلم عن المنديتس أو الالتزامات الخاصة على الأقل البنك الدولي وصندوق النقد، وتقدر تفرق أو تديكوا يعني إيه الفرق بين البنك والصندوق في التعامل مع المجتمع المدني، وكمان البوليسيز الخاصة بالجندر داخل هذه المؤسسات، وبعدين أكلمكم إزاي إحنا نقدر نشتبك معاهم وتجربتنا كأرب واتش في الاشتباك مع هذه المؤسسات، وكمان نقدر نتكلم في الخطوة الجاية معانا كأرب واتش وكابينة الكفينة الفترة الجاية في تونس. Emma, I'm going to give you the mic. Samah, can you introduce Emma, please?
I'm really sorry for all these technical problems. Emma is based in the UK and they switched to winter time, so we lost her for a bit. But I'm very happy to have her here with us today. So let me introduce Emma quickly and then give her the floor to say the different mandates of the different IFI. So Emma Burgisser is currently the economic justice lead at Christian Aid. And she has worked at the Bretton Wood Project, where she focused on challenging the power of the IMF, particularly in the field of gender equality and economic policy. Her background is in international human rights law and women's rights advocacy. So Emma, please go ahead.
Hi, Sma. Thanks so much, and my apologies for being so late. I did get the wrong time of the webinar, so I'm really glad to still be able to join and present. So thanks so much for having me, and I'll waste no time. I'm just going to share my screen. This one, allow. Can you just give me a nod that you can see my screen when you can, so I can, great, okay, thanks. So as Shereen was just saying, I'm going to try to give a very bird's eye overview of international financial institutions, what they do, their mandates, so that we as women's rights activists can make sense of that and understand how to engage with them for women's rights. So I'm trying to give a very broad overview, but I hope that in the discussion we'll be able to get to a lot more depth and answer a lot of questions. So I'm going to start out just with a quick definition of international finance institutions, or IFIs, just so that we start off all on the same page. So a financial institution is usually established by more than one country, and so it's important to start off with the idea that that means that they are subject to international law, or should be subject to international law, which is not always what it looks like in practice, but that is actually true. Its owners or shareholders are generally national governments, although other international institutions and other organizations can also figure as shareholders. And then just so that you know this difference, that most IFIs are the creations of multiple nations, which we call multilateral IFIs, but some can also be created just by two countries, which we would call bilateral. And so there's a lot of different types of IFIs, and so I'm not going to give you a screen trying to put them all together, because there's many of them, and there's a lot of different ways of organizing them, but just to have a stab at it, to give you some sense of how to think of these IFIs and what they look like. I have this overview, starting with the idea that on one side there, on the full left side, you have the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. And we'll get into this in more detail, but it's basically really important to understand that the IMF is an international financial institution like no other. It is unique in its role in the global economic and financial architecture, and it's very separated from other international finance institutions. Then you have what are called multilateral development banks, which are perhaps more the ones that you might think of when people talk about IFIs. So these are development banks that have been created by multiple countries, right? Which is why it's called multilateral. And so that's where, for example, the World Bank is. And that's also where you see regional development banks that, again, you have many, many different types of regional development banks. Not all of them by far are listed here. What makes a regional development bank is that they either provide loans to a specific region, or the shareholders are made up of countries that are all from a particular region. So you have some regional development banks where you have both rich and poor countries that are that make up the owners, but only lend to specific regions. And you also have regional development banks that are just sort of southern countries, owned by southern countries, which lend to southern countries. So you have a lot of different configurations. And so within that chapter, you have, for example, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the EBRD as well, which I know Kvinna has spent particular time on and attention to. So that's where the EBRD would be located as well. And you also have the Islamic Development Bank and AIIB, for example, the New Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Those are all examples of regional development banks. Then you also have bilateral development banks, and you have a few other IFIs, but I won't get into those, that have slightly different setups and structures and mandates. But the most important thing for, I think, this conversation is to understand this difference between multilateral development banks, or MDBs, and the IMF. And so just to emphasize that, I think we'll get into this more now, but the main thing to understand is that, in general, the mandate of multilateral development banks is about development, and the mandate of the IMF is not development. It's global. It's maintaining global economic stability. And so that means that how you approach these institutions can be very different. What they do is very different. And so, again, understanding that context is quite important. So because every mandate and structure of every multilateral development bank is slightly different, I can't explain the differences between all of them, but so I'm going to focus, as Shereen said, on the World Bank and the IMF. Those two organizations are called the Bretton Woods institutions because they were founded together in 1944 at a place called Bretton Woods in the US. And so I'm going to use those two to show you some of the differences between them, but also not that, those haven't just been picked randomly. The World Bank is by far, one of the biggest multilateral development banks. I've added a few figures here just to give you a general sense of what kind of numbers we're talking about in terms of how much these institutions make available in terms of lending. So in 2020, for example, the EBRD made 11 billion available. This is all USD. The Islamic Development Bank made 1.9 billion available in that same year, in 2020. So contrasting that to the World Bank that made 157 billion available in 2020, and then compare that to the IMF that made 165 billion available in 2020. So we're talking much bigger numbers generally for the fund and bank, which is why they're big players, and I'm going to focus on them. So so starting with their mission. So as I was just explaining, so the mission of the World Bank is ending extreme poverty and building shared prosperity. The missions of these organizations have changed over history, but I'm going to focus on their current mandates, right? So ending extreme poverty and building shared prosperity. The IMF's mandate is maintaining global economic stability in a nutshell. So those are very different jobs, right? One is very much about development, and the other is about sound macroeconomic policy, and how to make sure, especially that governments don't go into debt crises so that they don't end up in a position where they can't pay off their debts. That's very much what the IMF is concerned with, and the World Bank is much more about development, about road building and bridge building and school building and all the things that probably sound a lot more familiar to those of you that might be working in development. So in terms of their activities, what that means is that, so the IMF has 3 key functions, and the first one listed there is the most important, because it acts as a lender of last resort. What that means is that when governments are in a financial crisis, meaning they can't pay off their bills anymore, and they might be about to default, it's the job of the IMF to lend them money so that they can avoid that crisis and that they can not default, because the IMF's job is to maintain global stability and prevent countries from going into default. That makes the IMF, that's what makes the IMF very unique in the global economic architecture, because no other institution has been given that job, which is why the IMF has different powers, has more financial power than multilateral development banks, because it plays that important role. It also tries to fulfill that mandate by conducting what they call surveillance, which is basically keeping an eye on the entire global economy and trying to identify future risks to our economies. And so one way they do that is by going to every country every year, and they write a report about the state of that country's economy, and they provide recommendations on what they should be doing differently. So that's called surveillance, and those reports are called Article 4 reports. And they also provide technical assistance. But all of that power and that area of work means that the IMF is considered the sort of international expert when it comes to macroeconomic policy. On the World Bank, you have something very different. So the World Bank provides money or loans to governments and the private sector for both specific development projects. So things like building a dam or building a road, building a hospital, supporting a government in increasing their awareness about gender equality, for example. But they also do something called policy lending, which is a bit more similar to what the IMF does, which is lending governments money, not for specific projects, but so that they implement specific macroeconomic policies, which are usually about about making it easier for businesses to conduct their work and creating business-friendly environments in the case of the World Bank. And so again, that's what makes the World Bank, that's why people consider the World Bank the sort of expert when it comes to development, right? So then sort of more from a practical perspective, but this would influence how you would engage with both of these institutions, is just a short note on their structures. So the fund is relatively small. They have less than 2,500 employees, and generally speaking, it's a relatively hierarchical institution, which means that if you can get the bosses on board, if you can get the board on board with what you're saying, then generally you can expect to see that move through the institution and get implemented more or less. The World Bank is a much bigger structure. It's much more complicated. So they have more than 10,000 employees around the world. And the World Bank is actually made up of 4 different institutions that each, 4 main institutions that each do very different things. And they have different governance structures. They have a lot more country offices around the world. And it's also made up of a bunch of other sort of random trusts and bits and pieces that make up the organization. So it's a much more complex organization to understand. And in some ways, some decisions get taken much more at that national office level rather than just the board that you might be speaking to. And so trying to influence that organization is a completely different sort of kettle of fish. And related to that is just, again, a quick note on accountability. So for the World Bank, there are a few specific mechanisms in place that are designed to ensure some level of accountability for the work that they do and the impacts that they have on communities. In particular, the inspection panel is there to hear complaints of individual communities who have been impacted negatively by the work of the World Bank, by their projects, and they are there to listen to complaints and then rule on them. Their powers are limited. They don't have as much power to sort of provide compensation as much as we would like to see, for example. Those processes can be really complicated, but at least that body exists and is doing a lot of work. They also have a compliance advisor ombudsman, which is specifically for the International Finance Corporation, one of those 4 institutions that make up the World Bank. And their job is to make sure that the work of the IFC is in compliance with their own internally agreed rules and standards. And then in addition to that, they have an independent evaluation group that over the longer term tries to think about how well the World Bank is doing on certain policy questions, and always tries to provide sort of recommendations for the institution to get better at what it does. On the IMF side, none of that exists other than the Independent Evaluation Office. So the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF, it's very much about the institution learning over this very long term. So they will pick a topic, for example, like how well the organization works together with other organizations, or how well the organization works in conflict-affected states. And they'll write a big report about that, and they'll provide recommendations that, sometimes get followed up on, sometimes they don't. But they do not take individual complaints of communities or individual people. This idea that what the IMF does directly impacts people and can hurt people is not really in the culture of the IMF. It's not understood that way. And so there are no real accountability mechanisms in that same way as there is for the bank as the IMF. And then finally, just a note on the central policy approaches. So I'm going to really generalize here, but I assume that I've heard that you have this is a webinar in a series, and that you've already heard hopefully a lot about feminist economics and hopefully a few critiques of neoliberalism. So just to explain from a women's rights perspective, that what it has been a key dynamic between the IMF and the World Bank for a very long time is that because the IMF's job is about countries' good financial management, right, and avoiding debt crises, a lot of what they talk about still today is fiscal consolidation or austerity, right? It's about the government cutting spending, supposedly so that they can get their financial house in order, right? So over and over again, for almost every country, including in the MENA region, every year they tell them to cut what they're doing and to cut spending. Then after that, the World Bank, in this sort of classic dynamic between the fund and bank, the World Bank comes in and asks these questions, right? How are we supposed to finance development? How are we supposed to finance roads and schools, etc.? And if after a lot of IMF programs, the government has had to cut spending and has no capacity to, they argue that the government has no capacity to provide those services and has that money to provide that development, the answer then lies in the private sector, right? And that's what the World Bank does. They come in and they say, the only people that can provide this development is the private sector, because that's where the financing is. And so it's this classic sort of trick that they play between them that has led to decades worth of austerity and privatization policies across the world, including in the MENA region. And then finally, just a quick note again on their governance structures. So the sort of informal name by which people call the way that they're governed, it's called $1, 1 vote. That's because the way that decisions are made on the boards of these institutions are governed by a system called the quota system, which is basically a sort of formula that awards governments with big economies that are open a lot of voting power. And so that means that Western Europe and the US and Japan in particular have a huge amount of voting power on these boards, and that almost everybody else, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, get structurally underrepresented on their boards. So for example, the UK has its own board member that sits on the board of the IMF only representing the UK, whereas all of Sub-Saharan Africa is represented by 2 board members together. And so for most countries, they're represented on the board by this constituency, by a group of different countries that are represented by just 1 board member, and they have a lot less say on these boards. And the US's vote is even so big that they can block major decisions on their own. And then also the way that these institutions are led. So there's this historic agreement back from 1944 called the Gentleman's Agreement, this informal agreement that the World Bank will always be led by a US citizen, and that the IMF will always be led by a European. And that is still the case today. So even though that's not formally on paper anywhere, they will say they have an open merit-based process. It is still the case that throughout the whole history of these institutions, there's basically this agreement between Europe and the US to keep that in place. And they're able to do that because they have such big shares of votes on the board. So I'm aware of time, so I'm going to skip over some details I had about how these organizations approach women's rights, but we'll be really happy to talk more about that in the discussion. For now, I'll just end on a few sort of very general entry points for CSO advocacy with these institutions. And before going through them, I just thought I'd say, you know, the decision for any individual organization or even activist to engage with these institutions, you know, that's completely dependent on every organization's own mission, vision, and their own politics. I can't sit here and say it will be worthwhile for everybody working, for example, with women's rights communities around the world to say it's worth your time and money and resources to engage with these institutions. That's something that everyone has to work up for themselves. So I'm not advocating that everybody goes and talks to the fund and bank. But if you are interested in doing that, there are definitely a bunch of entry points, and there's definitely a lot of different ways of doing that. And so just a few. So, well, one of the things that historically has always just worked the best is having some leverage with the media, especially international financial media, because they pay a lot of attention to it and they care about how they are portrayed in the media. And so if you can get something into especially big American financial newspapers, you know, you will definitely get their attention. So as I mentioned before, there are some of these accountability mechanisms, especially on the World Bank side. Those are very formal procedures and they're quite complex, but if you are talking about a specific complaint in a specific project where you can show that the internal rules of the bank were violated, for example, there are some of those formal procedures that you could try to go through. But more generally, my starting point is always just finding out what these institutions are actually saying to your governments. In most cases, those things are public. So all of IMF surveillance documents and loan programs are available online. So you can, and for the World Bank as well, generally speaking. So you can find out a lot about what it is that these institutions are actually telling your governments, or sometimes making your governments do. And so you can start there. That's usually what I would advise. And so they have usually someone in the organization will be responsible for the policies being provided to your country. And so speaking to them, whether those are country offices or resident representatives, is usually, again, a good starting point. These institutions also mostly have organized public consultations sometimes on different things they're reviewing, on policies they're reviewing, and they usually open up to civil society, at least in a limited way. So, understanding what they're reviewing and being part of that is another option. Then for things, to influence really big decisions, for example, in the next 2 years, the IMF is reviewing their quota formula. So how much voting shares each countries get on the board is being reviewed in the next 2 years. So for really big decisions like that, that's where you really have to talk to your finance and development ministries who appoint the people on the board, because those are very high level, geopolitical decisions. But depending on your country context, that I understand, of course, that's not, those options are not open for everybody, of course. And it's different in the UK, right, where you have your own board member that you can access and talk to sometimes. And for countries that are in these joint constituencies, that's already a much harder thing to do. Then you have a bunch of civil society organizations that are, that not only work with the IFIs, work very closely with IFIs, but you have a bunch of them that are actually specifically dedicated to watching them and to supporting CSOs and activists in how to engage with them, and creating space for CSOs to engage with them. So like Arab Watch Coalition, or like my old organization, the Bretton Wood Project, it's literally our job to help people engage with them. So reaching out to them, asking for support and guidance is what some people are there for. You also have, for example, the Bank Information Center in the UK, in the US, that's more targeting the World Bank as well, for example. And then you may have heard about the annual and spring meetings that take place in April and October every year. So these are massive, massive international meetings where almost all the world's finance ministers, development ministers, representatives of other multilateral development banks, and IMF and World Bank staff all come together with CSOs and business people, like everybody in the development finance and sort of international economic architecture space come together. It can be quite a circus, especially when they're face to face, not during the pandemic like now. And it can be hard, in those types of spaces to get heard and seen, but it's definitely a place where you can meet a lot of people, you can organize, and there's always a civil society policy forum where there is some space, at least for CSOs specifically, to connect and organize and get their messages across to the IFIs as well. And then just finally, both the IMF and World Bank, and I think most regional development banks, have dedicated staff, whether it could be one person, but sometimes it's more, whose job it is specifically to engage with civil society groups. And so again, just if you want to know what they're doing, or if you want to understand how they work, just emailing them and getting in touch with them is, and understanding, asking them who they should be talking to in the organization, are usually some good starting points as well to try to tackle these groups that can be really big, right? But it doesn't have to be as intimidating as I know it can be sometimes, because ultimately they are just made up of individual people some of them will be open to what we say as critical CSOs and women's rights organizations, and some will not. But there is some space to navigate and try to change them, right? Which is ultimately what advocacy is about. So I'll leave it there for now. Would be really happy to take any and all questions. And again, apologize for being late. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Emma, for this presentation, and especially the tips on how to engage with IFIs. I think Emma set the global kind of scene of international development finance, and now Shereen can tell us more about what the Arab Watch Coalition is doing regionally and how they do engage with the IFIs regionally. So Shereen, the floor is yours. Shereen will be speaking in Arabic, so please go to the English channel if you would like to listen in English, and then please do not hesitate to ask your questions in the Q&A box.
شكرا إيما، كانت معلومات مهمة جدا. شكرا سماح. Can you stop sharing the screen please? خلينا نرجع تاني زي ما كنا بنتكلم في الأول، وخليني أبني على اللي زميلتي إيما اتكلمت فيه. زي ما احنا شفنا ال IMF مختلف ازاي عن البنك الدولي، ومختلف عن تقريبا معظم المؤسسات التنمويه التمويليه الكبرى العامه اللي احنا بنتكلم فيها. يعني احنا ما بنتكلمش على الاتحاد الاوروبي، ما بنتكلمش على المؤسسه الفرنسيه، احنا بنتكلم على البنوك العامه اللي احنا عندنا شير فيها كدول، وان كان شير صغير يعني، لكن احنا اعضاء فيها. علشان كده احنا اصحاب حقوق، احنا من حقنا نراقب ونتابع. زي ما ذكرت إما بعض الانتري بوينتس او النقاط المدخل اللي بتخلينا نقدر نشارك كمجتمع مدني. اللي احب ابرزه هنا انه مثلا البنك الدولي عنده سياسه خاصه باشراك المجتمع المدني، واحب اقول برضه انه بعد الثورات في 2011 المؤسسات التمويليه الكبرى دي طورت من نفسها كتير. يعني بدات تقول equality، بدات تقول gender policies، بدات تقول تتكلم على accountability بشكل اعمق، بدات تتكلم على اشراك المواطنين بشكل اعمق. معنى ذلك انه اشراك المواطنين هو امر مهم جدا داخل هذه المؤسسات علشان تضمن نجاعه استثماراتها، ومؤسسه زي صندوق النقد الدولي يضمن ان فلوسه ترجع له. في النهايه هي قروض مستحقه الدفع، هي ديون على اكتافنا ولازم تدفع. بس علشان تقدر تدفع وعلشان يبقى فيها حاجه اسمها استدامه القرض sustainability of debt، بالضروره لازم يبقى فيه بعض السياسات، واحنا included في هذه السياسات. احنا كمجتمع مدني، كاصحاب حقوق، كمنظمات نسويه اللي هي جزء من المجتمع المدني، نقدر نقعد على نفس الترابيزه معاهم. وده اللي بنحاول كارب واتش نعمله على مدار يعني عمرنا، سواء بشكل فورمال من قبل ما نتاسس كارب كتحالف اقليمي، او بعد ما تاسسنا كتحالف اقليمي وبقى الشغل اعمق شويه. زي ما ذكرت ان في ابواب مختلفه لاشراك المواطنين، اللي من ضمنها مثلا البنك الدولي لما بيجي يناقش الكونتري فريم ورك او الفريم ورك بالعربي، يعني الاطار العام لبلد بعينها علشان يبتدي يعمل الخطه مثلا الخمسيه السنويه الى اخره، بالضروره تحصل مشاورات مع المجتمع المدني. وهذه المشاورات بتكون مشاورات عامه، يعني حتى لو احنا ما تلقيناش دعوه من البنك الدولي لحضور المشاورات دي نقدر نحضرها. انا عايزه اخلي الامر كاننا بنحكي مع بعض الحكايه علشان افكك المساله ما تصبحش مصمته او تقنيه فقط، لكن نحولها من فكره التقنيه لفكره الحقوق اللي احنا كلنا مشتركين فيها. في لما ابتدى البنك الدولي مثلا يتناقش حول سياساته الحمائيه، لان البنك الدولي البنوك التمويليه الكبرى عندها حاجه اسمها الاطار الحمائي البيئي والاجتماعي. الاطار الحمائي ده هو اللي على اساسه بنقيس هل تم انتهاكه ولا لا. الاطار الاجتماعي ده بالضروره يبقى فيه تفاصيل ليها علاقه بحقوق العمال، تفاصيل ليها علاقه بالحق في السكن، بحقوق الاطفال، بقضايا النساء، الى اخره الى اخره. هم طبعا ما بيتبنوش اللغه الحقوقيه اللي احنا بنتكلم بيها، عندهم لغه اخرى. ولكن على مدار ال3 سنين لما كان البنك الدولي بيناقش سياساته الحمائيه، كان المجتمع المدني حوالين المنطقه، وانا وقتها كنت موجوده في مصر وموجوده في المغرب، بيطرح بدائل، واتعملت حمله عالميه. وده اللي بيأكد على دورنا في التآزر والتعاضد والمشاركه كمجتمع مدني على مستوى محلي، على مستوى اقليمي، على مستوى عالمي. في حمله عالميه بتتكلم على السياسات الحمائيه دي، وبالتالي كانت تكتيكات العمل مختلفه. يعني طرح درافتات بديله لاكثر حقوقيه تتبنى المنهج الحقوقي واللغه الحقوقيه في هذه السياسات الحمائيه. كذلك تكتيكات عمل مختلفة وبيانات وحملات حشد وتعبئة ومناصرة داخل هذه المؤسسات، ليس فقط خارج هذه المؤسسات، فيما له علاقة بالمجتمعات المحلية والمجتمع المدني. وفي الحقيقة مش هقدر أنكر إنه البنك تبنى أجزاء من الأطروحات اللي كان بيطرحها المجتمع المدني في الوقت ده. ما كانتش أجزاء عميقة زي ما احنا كنا بنأمل، ولكن نقدر نقول إنه في أجزاء مهمة تم تبنيها. الخطاب بتاع البنك نفسه تغير تجاه المجتمع المدني. ده الجزء الثاني من عمليات إشراك المواطنين داخل هذه المؤسسات. وبالمناسبة أنا عايزة أقول بس أوضح إنه البنك الدولي عادة بياخد الليد أو بيبقى عنده الأسبقية في تطوير السياسات، عشان نبقى واضحين، تطوير سياساته وتطوير السيف جاردز بتاعته او السياسات الحمائيه بتاعته، وبعديها بيتبعوا المؤسسات التمويليه المختلفه زي الاي بي ار دي، زي الاي اي بي، زي الافريكان ديفلوبمنت بانك. على الاقل دي اللي بيشتغلوا في المنطقه بتاعتنا. وطبعا بيضاف عليها بعض الاشياء الخاصه بكل مؤسسه تمويليه او بيقل، لكن عاده البنك الدولي بيبقى عنده الليد، وخصوصا في السياسات الخاصه باشراك المواطنين والجندر بوليسيز والترانسبيرنسي الى اخره، الشفافيه والى اخره. جزء تاني من عمليه اشراك المواطنين اللي مهم نبقى حاطينها في دماغنا، انه اي مشروع بيطبق من المؤسسات التمويليه الكبرى لازم تحصل عليه مشاورات. المشاورات دي بتبقى من قبل يعني وقت يعني توقيع العقد علشان ناخد القرض ده ويتم تنفيذ المشروع، وخلال تنفيذ المشروع بمراحله، ومع نهاية المشروع. من حقنا كمجتمع مدني نقعد على الترابيزة معاهم ونقول رأينا، ومن حق الإفكت المتأثرين بهذا المشروع، سواء ده كان تأثير جيد ولا تأثير سلبي، إن هم يبقوا موجودين ويحضروا هذه المشاورات. ولو كان الستيك هولدرز أو أصحاب الحقوق الحقيقيين لم يدعوا لهذه المشاورات، هنا يصبح خلل، ونقدر ننتقل لجزء تاني من إشراك المواطنين أو إحنا كمجتمع مدني، وهو آليات الشكاوى. وآليات الشكاوى زي ما كانت أشارت ليها الزميلة إيما، ليها أكثر من شق وأكثر من أداة على مختلف مؤسسات التمويلية الكبرى، ولكن جميع مؤسسات التمويلية الكبرى لديها آليات شكاوى نقدر نستخدمها كمواطنين، إلا صندوق النقد الدولي لأنه له طبيعة مختلفة. فبالنسبة للبنك الدولي مثلا بأذرعه المختلفة، خلينا نتكلم على الذراع التنموي والذراع الاستثماري. الورلد بانك اللي بنقول عليه وورلد بانك، والاي اف سي اللي هو مؤسسة التمويل الدولية. زي ما برضو ما أشرت الزميلة إيما، عندنا السي او والانسبكشن بانل، لجنة التحقيق، والكيان المحقق. يعني هي نفس تقريبا المسمى ونفس طريقة العمل كمان. كأرب واتش من أكتر من 10 سنين لما كنا لسه ما تأسسناش بشكل رسمي، حصل مشاورات على الدراسة التشخيصية في اليمن. وفي الحقيقة المشاورات دي كانت بالإنجليزي، والدراسة التشخيصية صادرة بالإنجليزي، والمجتمع المدني ما قدرش يتفاعل خلال المشاورات لأنه مش قادر يقرأ الدراسة، ولا إن المشاورات حصلت باللغة الإنجليزية، واللي كان في الحقيقة أمر غير يعني مقبول بالمرة. ولكن مؤسسة من هي مؤسسات أعضاء التحالف في اليمن الآن قدمت شكوى على إنه إحنا محتاجين الدوكيومنتس دي أو الوثائق دي تكون متوفرة باللغة العربية، والمشاورات تتم باللغة العربية، لأنه إحنا المتأثرين وإحنا بنتكلم اللغة العربية. إحنا فاهمين إنه في المنطقة مش كلنا بنتكلم عربي، كتير منا سكان أصليين ما بيستخدموش اللغة العربية، ولكن الدساتير اللي موجودة في دولنا بتنص على الأقل يستخدموا اللغة اللي موجودة الأولى في الدستور عشان يقدروا يتواصلوا معانا. مش هيتكلموا إنجليزي ولا فرنساوي، فبالتالي إحنا ما نفهمش اللي بيحصل وإحنا متأثرين. فالشكوى تم قبولها، وفعلا كل الوثائق اللي موجودة، معظم الوثائق اللي موجوده سواء للسياسات او المشاريع الخاصه بالمنطقه الشرق الاوسط وشمال افريقيا هي موجوده بالعربي. وفي ديتيلز انا مش عايزه ادخل لكم فيها دلوقتي، انا عايزه اديكم الامر بشكل عام. ده جزء تاني على في خلال ما المشروع شغال نقدر نستخدم حاجه اسمها الجريفنس ميكانيزم، اللي هي آلية شكاوى برضو ولكن داخليه او على مستوى محلي، تقدر تتواصل بيها مع بتوفرها المقترض، وكمان ما عندوش جزء رقابي ولكن عنده نظره عامه ليها المؤسسه المقترضه، سواء بنك دولي EBRD الى اخره. بنك دولي عامه. الجريفنس ميكانيزم دي تقدر ترفع، المفروض يبقى فيها تليفون، يبقى فيه ايميل، تقدر تتواصل تقول انا متضرر، انا بقدم شكوى، ولو ما تمش حلها على الارض بتتنقل لجزء تاني من الاكونتابيلتي ميكانيزم وتروح للسي او او الانسبكشن بانل. ده فيما له علاقه بالورلد بانك. وبالنسبه للاي بي ار دي في حاجه اسمها الاي بام، كذلك الاكونتابيلتي ميكانيزم خاصه للاي اي بي وايضا الافريكان ديفلوبمنت بانك. في سبل كتيره لاشراك المواطنين، المهم ان احنا نستخدمها وان احنا نستغلها. بالنسبه لصندوق النقد الدولي، وطبعا صندوق النقد الدولي في تونس دلوقتي في الوقت اللي احنا فيه ده هو يعني موضوع كبير قوي 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 يتم النقاش فيه الان، لان تونس بصدد التقديم لبرنامج جديد وقرض جديد للصندوق الوقت الجاي. وفي الحقيقه تم يعني تونس طلبت بشكل رسمي في 29 اكتوبر الماضي طلب بالحصول على القرض. النيغوشيشنز ولا الدسكشنز بين الدولة وبين الصندوق ما زالت قائمة، لأنه الدولة محتاجة أنها تقدم مشروع لبعض الإصلاحات الاقتصادية اللي ممكن ياخد وقت، ولكن قرض الصندوق هو في الحقيقة أمر واقع محتاجين نتعامل معاه، محتاجين نعرف إيه هي الانتري بوينتس داخل الصندوق، مع إنه هو ما عندوش سياسات إشراك مواطنين بالمرة، مع إنه هو ما عندوش توجهات واضحة في البوليسيز بتاعته كبيرة يعني ضخمة زي المؤسسات التمويلية الكبرى الأخرى تجاه إشراك المواطنين. ولكن لأنه الصندوق كمان غير من خطابه الوقت اللي فات، هنلاقي في حاجة بيعملها الصندوق كل ما يعمل بروجرام جديد اسمها الارتكل 4 أو مشاورات المادة الرابعة. وفي المادة الرابعة يتم التشاور، في مشاورات المادة الرابعة يتم التشاور مع المجتمع المدني في الفترة دي. ولاحظنا في المشاورات المادة الرابعة في الوقت اللي فات كان في توصيات لها علاقة بإشراك المواطنين، لها علاقة وأنا في رأيي إنه الحكامة الرشيدة، الترانسبارنسي والأكسس تو يعني الحوكمة والشفافية والوصول إلى المعلومة كسياسات هي جزء منها يتضمن إشراك المواطنين، وإلا تبقى نفية. وده اللي بنستخدمه لما بنشتغل في حملات حشد وتعبئة ومناصرة داخل هذه المؤسسات أو مع المجتمع المدني. خليني أديكم مثال ممكن يبقى ممكن تبقوا عارفينه مثلا لان الموضوع كان مشهور جدا جدا، مش مع الصندوق النقد ولكن مع الاي اف سي، فيما له علاقه بآلية الشكاوى وفيما له علاقه بحملات الحشد والتعبئه والمناصره داخل هذه المؤسسات. هنقل تاني على البنك الدولي، والمره دي هتكلم على الاي اف سي، مؤسسه التمويل الدوليه. هتكلم على الورلد بانك، قصدي الورلد بانك اللي هي الذراع التنموي للبنك. الذراع التنموي للبنك كان بيمول مشروع اسمه مشروع سد بسري في لبنان. مشروع سد بسري في لبنان هو مشروع هيتم اقامته في وادي بسري، و في الحقيقه وادي بسري ده هو وادي حيوي جدا في تنوع ايكولوجي شديد كبير، واقامه السد هتقتل التنوع ده، بل كمان هتقتل الاراضي الزراعيه اللي على ضفتي هذا الوادي. المجتمع المدني اللبناني سنين وهو بيناضل علشان يوقف هذا المشروع، استخدم كل اليات الشكاوى. وفي الحقيقه الاليات قدم 3 شكاوى. عرب واتش كانوا انفولد في اخر شكوى منهم، وال3 شكاوى تم رفضهم لاسباب تقنيه. فكان هنا مرحله مختلفه من عملنا كمجتمع مدني وكمواطنين متاثرين في الادفوكسي داخل البنك الدولي. فبالتالي صحيح احنا لجأنا لآليات الشكاوى، وصحيح ما كانتش بالنسبه لنا ناجعه، لكن المشروع لو تم تنفيذه كان هيبقى مؤذي جدا جدا للبنانيين. ولو نفتكر وقت الحراك في لبنان كانوا بيستخدموا جمله احنا السد بوجه السد، اللي كانت متعلقه، اللي كانوا بيستخدموها النشطاء في حركه ضد سد بسري. في الحقيقه زي ما قلت لكم نقلنا الادفوكسي لليفل مختلف، ليفل اعلى، وهو مش ليفل صعب ومش ليفل بعيد. زي ما كانت بتتكلم ايمي على الهيراركيه بتاعه الورلد بانك، احنا ابتدينا او وقتها يعني ابتدينا نعمل ادفوكسي كامبين داخل البورد اوف دايركتورز. كنا بنفهم اكتر مين عنده علاقه بالحقوق البيئيه، مين عنده علاقه بحقوق الانسان من البورد اوف دايركتورز دول، علشان نقدر ناخدهم في صفنا. وقد كان تم ايقاف مشروع سد بسري، تمويل مشروع سد بسري العام الماضي اخر السنه اللي فاتت، وده كان بالنسبه لنا انجاز كبير قوي للنشطاء في لبنان والنشطاء حول المنطقه، وايضا السبورترز حوالين العالم. اللي اقصد اقوله انه مداخل اشراك المجتمع المدني كبيره وكتيره، وزي ما قالت ايمي احنا مثلا وجودنا كارب واتش في المنطقه بنشتغل على الريجن بشكل محلي وبشكل اقليمي، نقدر نساعد. فكلمونا لو انتوا عايزين تتواصلوا. مؤسسات كتيره حوالين العالم شركاء، واللي احنا بنشتغل بنتقاطع يمكن يوميا مع بعض، اللي بيسمونا بنك ووتشرز او مراقبين البنوك. لكن مش بس بنك ووتشرز، لكن هو كمان جزء كبير منهم هم ديفندرز ان ديفلوبمنت، يعني مدافعين عن حقوق عن المدافعين في التنميه. ايضا نقدر نتكاتف. احنا بنصدق وبنؤمن بالتكامليه في العمل، وبنؤمن ب ضروره انه يكون صوت المجتمعات المحليه، سواء المجتمع المدني بشكله الواسع، سواء على مستوى محل يعني نقابات، مؤسسات مجتمع مدني الى اخره الى اخره، مرورا ايضا بالحركات الاجتماعيه، وايضا اصحاب الحقوق حتى ان كانوا مش بشكل رسمي، يعني بالضروره صوتهم يكون موجود ويتسمع داخل هذه المؤسسات. هقول لكم حاجه شخصيه جدا جدا. بعد الثوره الحاجه الوحيده اللي خلتني اقدر اواصل هو الملف ده. كان ملف جديد عليا، وكان ملف غريب عليا، وكنت حاسه ان هو تقني جدا، لكن اكتشفت انه في طاقه نور، في طاقه نور، لكن محتاجه ان احنا يبقى عندنا نفس طويل، نفس طويل. وانا جايه من المدرسه بتاعه في الاصل قبل ال10 سنين اللي فاتوا بتاعه انا دول امبرياليين ودول نيو ليبرال ومؤذيين، وانا مش عايزه اقعد معاهم على نفس الترابيزه. لكن اكتشفت انه لا، لانه صوتنا اتسمع في 2011، فصوتنا يمكن ويقدر يبقى مسموع على مدار السنين الجايه. الملف ده كان بالنسبه لي منقذ. انا عايزه اقول للمؤسسات اللي موجوده هنا انه مش صعب خالص ابدا نبتدي نشتغل على مراقبه حقوقنا داخل هذه المؤسسات. بالنسبه للمؤسسات النسويه، ففي قوام التحالف الاعضاء بتوع مؤسسات نسويه اللي كانوا في الوقت اللي فات بيراقبوا مثلا في المغرب مشروع بعينه وهو تنميه محليه كازابلانكا، كل ما هو علاقه بقضايا النساء والجندر داخل هذا المشروع كان بيتم مراقبته، وسيتم اصدار التقرير قريبا هشاركه معاكم. الوقت الجاي احنا كمان هنكون موجودين في تونس، واكيد كفينة هيساعدونا في التواصل معاكم كمؤسسات محليه، علشان احنا بصدد عمل تدريب اوضح حول مراقبه هذه المؤسسات بحضور بعض هذه المؤسسات زي صندوق النقد والبنك الدولي والإبردي في تونس تحديدا، عشان يعرضوا البورتفوليو بتاعهم والسياسات اللي بيشتغلوا عليها داخل المنطقه، داخل تونس تحديدا، والمشاريع كمان. فانا مش عايزه ابقى بطول عليكم، وانا عايزه ادي وقت اكبر للنقاش، فبشكركم. شكرا.
Thank you so much, Shereen. شكرا. And I'm gonna switch to English again. You actually answered one of the questions that I wanted to ask you. That was about how to start engaging with the IFIs. You come from a filmmaker background, from education background, and Emma comes from international human rights background. But now you are the experts on these matters and on the advocacy towards the international financial institutions. So if you can tell us, what did you start with? What very specific topic did you start with? And how things got easier? Because while doing our work, people feel that the economic issue is very elitist and that it is not accessible to everyone. So can you help us with tips to how to democratize this?
اجاوب ولا؟
اوكي.
انا هجاوب بالعربي برضه. يعني I hope Emma that you can follow Arabic with our perfect translators here. ولكن في الحقيقة الأمر بدأ معايا إن إحنا كنا في حملة اسمها مصريين ضد الفحم، بنشتغل على قضايا الفحم في مصر، ضد قضايا الفحم يعني. وكان وقتها مشروع سيتم تمويله في منطقة اسمها الحمراوين على البحر الأحمر من قبل البنك الدولي، وهو مشروع باور بلانت، يعني محطة كهرباء حرارية هتشتغل بالفحم. وفي الحقيقة لأنه زي ما قلت الملف مش سهل بس مش صعب كمان، وتاني لأنه أنا جاية من خلفية هي مش اقتصادية بالمرة، هي مور ارت اند كلتشر، لكن كمان عندها شق حقوقي فيما علاقة بالأفلام اللي كنت بشتغل عليها في الوقت ده. فكنت بعمل فيلم اسمه بيتكلم عن الفحم في مصر، وتقاطعنا مع اللي يعني سيتضرروا من هذا المشروع، وعرفنا انه البنك بصدد التشاور. قعدنا مع البنك وقتها لان احنا نقدر نرفع سماعه تليفون، نبعت ايميلات ونطلب ان احنا نقعد معاهم. وقتها كمان بنك انفورميشن سنتر في واشنطن ساعدونا ان احنا نوصل للهيد كوارترز، لانه المكتب الاقليمي ما كانش بيرد علينا، المكتب موجود في مصر ما كانش بيرد علينا. ووقتها لما عرفنا بوجود المشاورات احنا عملنا تحرك على الارض، تحرك داخل قاعه المشاورات وتحرك خارج قاعه المشاورات. وانا مش عايزه اقول ان انا بحرض ولا حاجه يعني، ولكن ده اللي حصل بشكل حقيقي. في الحقيقه المشروع تم ايقاف تمويله من قبل البنك الدولي، وده اللي ادانا اكتر احساس بانه لا في امل. وعايزه اقول حاجه، ساعات عشان الاطار العام اللي احنا بنشتغل فيه في دولنا ممكن جدا ما يديناش فرصه نقعد مع صناع القرار داخل هذه الدول، لكن الاطار بقى الاكبر اللي بنشتغل فيه على مراقبه المؤسسات التمويليه الدوليه يقدر يدينا بعض المعلومات ويقدر يخلينا ناثر انا بس مش عايزه ادي great expectations. كل حاجه بتيجي بتعب وشقه، ويمكن احنا ما نشوفهاش، ولادنا اللي يشوفوها على مدار السنين، لكن نقدر من خلال تواصلنا مع هذه المؤسسات نعرف ايه اللي حصل على الارض. يعني الكونتكست اللي انا جايه منه مش عايزه اقول لكم هو شكله عامل ازاي طبعا، لكن كلنا عارفين بيخلي بعض المعلومات صعبه. بعض الدول ما عندهاش سياسات افصاح، انما بنقدر من خلال وجودنا مع هذه المؤسسات يبقى عندنا درايه اكبر، وده بيخلينا نحاول نتحرك بشكل اكبر في ملفات بعينها على الارض. شكرا. بدي المايك لإيما.
Thanks, Shereen. I don't know if my answer is as inspiring as yours, but just to say as well from a personal perspective, so I'm not an economist either. So as Sama explained, my background was a bit in international law, and especially in the human rights and women's rights space. And I think that that's an advantage. It's not. It can be. Once you've studied economics in a formal way, especially because economic education is really hijacked by neoliberal thinking, it can really put you in this box of thinking about the economy for the economy's sake, and that everything around us, our societies, our families, our lives, our bodies need to work for the economy. And if you've not had that kind of training, if you've not been brainwashed in that wrong way, if your starting point is human rights, if your starting point is the lived realities of women's rights communities, for example, that you perhaps work with, it can be much easier for you to see that what we should be asking is what the economy is for and what the economy is doing for us, for people, rather than the other way around. And so yes, not an economist either. I joined this IMF and World Bank watchdog group, and I had to pick these things up and learn it there. But now I'm an economic justice lead at an NGO. Again, not being an economist, but being able to understand the economic impacts and how these policies, impact real people. I think that's our gift that we as activists are trying to get our head around. Just from a policy perspective, if you're interested, I'm going to talk a bit about the IMF just because that's what I particularly focused on in my time with the Bretton Wood Project. So, I understand that monetary policy, all this macroeconomic stuff can sound really intimidating and technical. I think a really nice starting point from a policy perspective is fiscal policy. And fiscal policy just means how governments spend money and how governments raise money. And so you can start asking really basic sort of justice questions, women's rights questions around that. Are governments spending money on the right things that matter to me or matter to my community? And who are they raising taxes from? And is that fair? And are they raising taxes from those who are most able to pay or not? Those are some really basic entry points. Those are exactly the sort of questions that the IMF deals with every day, that once you start getting into, you'll see that a lot of the policies they push are not the ones that benefit women in particular. I would hold right that that overwhelmingly their policies sort of structurally undermine women's rights, especially through their fiscal policies. And so I would recommend that as a starting point. And if you're perhaps a little bit more advanced, I think I saw that the Women's Budget Group was part of these webinars as well. So if you're already at a stage where you can look at a public budget and you understand how changing how much money is made available for healthcare or education or for social protection, how that can impact men and women differently, and how that can disproportionately impact women. If you're at that stage, the one thing I have to say in everything I speak at is that in 2018, the IMF adopted this new policy on gender issues. And it includes this one paragraph, paragraph 26, that specifically says that some of the IMF's conventional policy advice can exacerbate gender inequality. And in those instances, the IMF should consider an alternative policy mix. And so hypothetically, that gives us some internal policy to work with, right? It's not much. It's not an accountability mechanism. It's not, human rights accountability, but it's a very little part that perhaps we as feminists could use. But so far in practice, that has not happened yet. There has been no example yet of the IMF sort of publicly saying, oh, this policy that we were going to recommend in this country, we did some analysis and we worked out that it exacerbates gender inequality, so we've gone for this other set of policies. That has not happened yet. And so there's some work with some people inside the IMF trying to get the IMF to do that. But I think there's a really like an opportunity for women's rights groups on the ground to have that conversation with them. Basically, what I'm saying is, if you can show, if you can make a case, if you can especially gather some evidence to show that a particular policy that the IMF wants your country to adopt will exacerbate gender inequality, you should be able to go to the country representative, you should be able to go to the IMF, point to this policy and say, look, this is why you should change it to something more progressive or something else. And so I would really advise, as an entry point, that's basically the strongest thing we have to work with as women's rights organizations right now, with the IMF at least. Thanks. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Emma, for this. I didn't know about this, so it's one of the most powerful things to use in the time being. And thank you as well for you and Shereen for giving the examples of the Bisri Dam in Lebanon and the power plant in Egypt. And I know that for the Bisri Dam, there were groups of women who actually organized and mobilized to present an argumentary from a feminist perspective, saying that this dam would affect their livelihoods. So I guess maybe they used that in a way or another. I still have many questions, but I think I have a very contextualized question now, since Shereen mentioned the discussions happening between Tunisia and the IMF right now, and like the very, very small policy space that we have to negotiate and to be realistic in Tunisia, in the current circumstances, we need a loan, but this will have more negative consequences, as we all know. But in your opinion, and looking at other experiences that you are for sure more aware of, what are the alternatives for this if we do not get the loan? And then what happened in other places where they did not get a loan? What were the alternatives? Is there like a way out of this situation, in your opinion?
أحب نبقى رياليستيك، يعني نبقى نتكلم من أرض الواقع. هو في الحقيقة القرض هيتم تمريره، عشان نبقى واضحين. أنا بتكلم على تونس بالذات. القرض هيتم تمريره بطبيعة الحال، لأنه ده لما بتكلم على الإطار العام هيدي تونس فرصة أنها تاخد قروض أخرى وينقذها من الوضع اللي هي فيه. لكن ما ينفعش أبداً القرض ده يتم تمريره فقط وفول ستوب. لا، ما ينفعش الشعب التونسي يعاني من سياسات التقشفية بالشكل يعني السفير، يعني المؤذي اللي هيكون موجود مرة أخرى، لأنه في الحقيقة لا الاقتصاد مستحمل ولا الشعب مستحمل، يعني عشان نبقى واضحين. في رأيي الحل بالضرورة يكون عملي، وهو اللي يمكن احنا بدأنا فيه كمان كأرب واتش في تونس. السنه اللي فاتت، واما كانت جزء كمان من الحمله ده من المؤسسين للحمله اللي نون اوفيشال، يعني نون اوفيشال كده، تم اطلاقه السنه اللي فاتت ضد السياسات التقشفيه، انهاء السياسات التقشفيه. وفي الحقيقه هو اتطور شويه علشان ياخد شكل اكثر، يعني له بنى اكثر يعني. ف لاننا اعضاء في هذا الكيان، وايضا هذه اهتماماتنا وده الملف اللي بنشتغل عليه، ابتدينا اطلقنا الميتنج زيرو بنسميه، عشان نقدر نحدد الاحتياجات ونعرف هنشتغل ازاي على الارض لحمله انهاء التقشف على مستوى الاقليم، شرق اوسط شمال افريقيا او منطقه مشرق المغرب. وعلشان الحمله دي تبقى ناجحه كان لازم نشتغل على country by country، بلد ببلد، لانه كل بلد، وده اللي المؤسسات التمويليه الكبرى لازم تفهمه، كل بلد عندها خصوصياتها، كل بلد عندها المنظومه الاجور والمنظومه الضريبيه والشكل الاقتصادي العام بتاعها. مصر مختلفه عن تونس، مختلفه عن الاردن الى اخره، وده مشكلتنا كبيره مع المؤسسات التمويليه الكبرى، ان هم بيتعاملوا ببوليسيز عامه ويطبقوها علينا، مش بيراعوا احنا بنعيش ازاي. ف احنا بصدد اطلاق الوقت الجاي في تونس مع اعضائنا في تونس وشركائنا في تونس هي حمله ضد سياسات التقشف. وعلشان كده انا كمان يعني احنا اتكلمنا في ده يا سماح، لكن انا كمان بدعو كفينة تبقى موجوده في الدسكشنز بتاعت الحمله دي اللي هتبقى الشهر الجاي في ديسمبر في تونس، او الابديت يو with all the dates و everything. بس هو ده اللي نقدر نشتغل عليه كمجتمع مدني وكمجتمعات محليه دلوقتي، علشان وافتكر الحمله دي هتقدر تطرح alternatives للسياسات التقشفيه. مع العلم تاني القرض بتاع الصندوق هو امر واقع، امر واقع لازم اتعامل معاه ومش لازم يضرني. في النهايه انا بتضر او بتاثر كمواطن، سواء انا خدت القرض وتم تنفيذه، او سواء في هرجع القرض ازاي كمديونيه. وفي الحقيقه الشقين دول بالذات اللي عايزه تشتغل عليهم حمله انهاء التقشف في تونس الوقت الجاي. عشان كده بقول لك خلينا واقعيين، احنا نقدر نعمل ايه؟ نقدر نعمل ايه؟ هو انتاج ثروه، لكن انتاج ثروه ازاي وانا ما عنديش قطاعات بعينها قادره تنتج، ما عنديش صناعات بعينها قادره تنتج، ومحتاج ريفورمز، محتاج عمل، يعني لازم ده يمشي ان باراليل مع ده عشان اقدر بعد كده ما اخدش قروض. فلازم اتعامل بحكمه في القرض ده، لازم اعمل بحكمه ما تقتلنيش، تساعدني. بس شكرا.
Thank you, Shereen. شكرا. I don't know if Emma has anything to add to this.
Yeah, just because it's a very good question. I think when it comes to the IMF, in terms of, you know, what's the alternative, I think you raise a really important point that is really, I think, important for all of us to understand in this space, that really gets to some of the really big picture global architecture questions, which is, so if the IMF is the only is the one, you know, as I explained, right, the IMF is designated as in this special role as lender of last resort. So when governments get into massive debt problems, the IMF is supposed to get them out of it. But the way in which the IMF can do that is by lending them more money, for arguably, like, for you know, on good terms, or not, you know, depending on your perspective. But that's right now how the global system works, that if countries are so indebted that they are facing default, the IMF is supposed to come in and lend them even more money. And the IMF's internal rules even say that the IMF is not supposed to lend to countries whose debts are already unsustainable. So that makes no sense. When you get into sort of how this system was designed in the first place and how it's supposed to work, you'll find very quickly that honestly it makes no sense. And you can understand that if you compare it to any national context. So in a national, just think of it in any normal national context, you have rules about what happens when an individual person or a company takes on too much debts, right? In most countries, you have something called a bankruptcy law or a bankruptcy code, and you have a court that will have agreed on a set of rules on what to do in that situation, right? And it usually involves something around cancellation or restructuring of the debts, but making sure that this person, especially when we're talking about individual people, that their basic needs are still taken care of, right? And they don't end up homeless or etc. When it comes to governments in that international system, there's no such system. So there is nothing that right now makes sure that governments still have the ability to take care of their fundamental human rights when they're in this massive debt crisis, which many of them are right now. And there's no organized set of rules about how to restructure or cancel debts. It's completely dependent right now on the people who own these debts, which used to be just other governments, right? But now it's turned into a lot of private banks and just private financial institutions that has made it incredibly complicated and difficult and basically impossible to resolve countries that are really in serious debt crises. And so for a very long time, the debt justice community has offered a very specific solution to this, which is an international debt workout mechanism, an international body that has the authority to get all the creditors around the table and make them cancel some debts, restructure debts, and make sure that governments still have what they need to take care of their people's fundamental human rights. So that's a particular solution to a particular problem. And until something like that is in place, we're going to continue having this sort of broken system in which the IMF plays this really strange, contradictory role, right? Where they're supposed to maintain global financial stability. They're not supposed to add more unsustainable debt to countries already in debt, but that's kind of the only thing that they can do because that's their role. So yeah, so that's part of why that question is really important. What's the alternative? Because in the current system, there aren't a lot of good alternatives. Thanks. We'd love to hear some questions from the floor. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. And you already answered my following question on the cancellation of debt and how this happens. We have a question from Hajar Masoudi who says, what about the legitimacy of the notation agency that provide mutilated photos, notations, indexes, indicators of our countries that IFIs use to impose as their severe, I guess, policies or austerity measures?
Yes, I think I know what you're talking about. So I can give a few examples. So for example, the World Bank, they for a very long time produced something called the Doing Business Rankings, a report that ranked every country in the world according to how business friendly their countries are. And that ranking really rewarded the undermining of labor rights and really regressive tax policies that hurt basically regular people. And so CSOs had been opposed to this for a very long time, but a lot of governments paid a lot of attention to these rankings, and it wouldn't be like a condition, technically, it wouldn't be forced on them, but there would be a lot of competition amongst countries to get higher on these rankings because it would stimulate a lot of direct investment, foreign direct investment into economies. And so some countries, their entire economic policy has been about just getting higher on these rankings. But in perhaps some sort of unexpected good news, just a few months ago, the World Bank actually canceled their doing business rankings, not because of our concerns of human rights, etc., but because of there were irregularities in the data. There was basically sort of stories of corruption of how the data was manipulated, and so they canceled it. And they've just announced, like 2 weeks ago, they've announced that they're going to come up with some new type of version of this in 2 years' time. So talking about civil society opportunities to influence these institutions, we basically now have a 2-year window to influence what this new version might look like, and whether it will have those same sort of terrible standards in it that really undermine our rights. So I would encourage you all to get involved in that one. But it's not just the doing business rankings, right? So, for example, the World Bank and IMF, they also co-own a debt sustainability assessment, which is this assessment of how sustainable they think an individual country's debt is. So those assessments are really important for investors and for international markets, but they're really owned by those two organizations. And again, obviously they haven't, as you hopefully can guess by now, they have not been developed with human rights standards, being taken into account at all. And so that's another way through these sort of informal measures, what they call often knowledge products, indirect ways in which they can influence countries' policies, and play such a big role in that international macroeconomic and development space. So those are indirect. But then, as the question said, you also have conditions, right? So both the IMF and World Bank, so they have the power to lend to governments on the condition that they change their macroeconomic policies. And especially, again, when you're talking about the IMF, that's incredibly perverted, right? Because it's the IMF's job to lend to countries that are in enormous crises that don't have a lot of options other than defaulting, right? Which brings with it its own massive human rights crises usually. So for a lot of countries, they don't have a lot of other options sometimes than to go to the IMF, and then for them to impose these conditions that are decided in this incredibly undemocratic way. That's historically, the massive sort of fundamental problem with how these institutions work, right? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emma. Shereen, do you have anything to say about this?
انا في الحقيقه ما عنديش اضافه اكتر من اللي ايما وضحته، لانه للاسف في النهايه الكونديشناليتيز او المشروطيه هي امر واقع اللي كمان كمجتمع مدني حوالين العالم، مش بس في المنطقه، بنحاول ان احنا ندافع او نادفوكيت انها تبقى مش مشروطيه فقط لصالح البيزنس ولا الماني ولا الانفستمنت، تبقى كمان مشروطيه لصالح الشعوب. احنا فاهمين انه عادي ده بنك وعنده مشروطيه، واول كليم اي بنك من دول سواء يعني بنوك تمويليه او سواء صندوق النقد هيقول لك انا مش مؤسسه حقوقيه، انا بنك او انا مؤسسه تمويليه. انما انا شايفه ايما بتكتب في الشات، لكن هي امر واقع محتاجين نتعامل معاه. وهنا كمان بتيجي اكتر كمان المذاكره، ان احنا كمجتمع مدني بالضروره نبقى فاهمين المشروطيه دي واقعها شكله عامل ازاي، وايه الالترناتيفز. تاني احب اقول انه الملف ده محتاج طولة نفس علشان يبقى فيه امباكت كبيره وامباكت حقيقيه، وما ينفعش جزء كبير من دورنا كمجتمع مدني ان to hold those international financial institutions accountable، ان هم ما يعملوش مش بس خروقات على مستوى البروجكت، لكن خروقات على مستوى السياسات وصندوق النقد بالذات هو بيأثر بشكل فعلي وكبير في حياتنا اليومية. دي حقيقة. علشان كده ان احنا يعني نفضل نكيب بوشنج ضد السياسات والمشروطية اللي ليها علاقة بالتقشف، ده مهم جدا يبقى شغلنا الشاغل الوقت الجاي. ومهم جدا كل المؤسسات وكل المجتمع المدني على مختلف اطيافه، سواء مؤسسات بتشتغل على حقوق النساء، مؤسسات نسويه، او بتشتغل على المناخ والبيئه، او مؤسسات بتشتغل على حقوق اجتماعيه واقتصاديه، في المطلق مهم جدا ده يبقى شغلها الشاغل. شكرا.
شكرا شيرين. And thank you, Emma, for your very comprehensive answers. We are running out of time. We need to wrap up very, very soon. But I have like a last question. As you both explained how the IFIs work and how the IMF is different from the World Bank and from other regional development banks, etc. But then practically on the ground, while doing advocacy concretely, we hear a lot that all these other development banks or the World Bank are all depending on the IMF kind of decisions about countries. So how to which extent this is true, and how to navigate through this while doing advocacy?
Shereen, do you want to? I mean, I can have a go. If I understood your question correctly, how much do other multilateral development banks rely on the IMF for their decisions and work? Yeah,
sorry. Like, is the IMF the most important international financial institution to direct our advocacy towards?
Well. So my job was specifically to focus on the IMF. So my answer is quite biased and would say, yes, the IMF is definitely most important. So as I explained, the IMF does have this special role in the international architecture. It has the most financial firepower as well. Because it has this unique ability to basically back up governments when they're really in crisis, everybody else in the international financial and development system does look to the IMF for how they, especially how they assess a country, right? So and the state of their economy and how sustainable their economy is. So, for example, there might be a country that might be highly indebted, that it might be very expensive to borrow money on financial markets, and it might be difficult for them to borrow money from other multilateral development banks. But if the IMF comes out and says they're going to provide them with a big loan program, or even if they just say an assessment that says they're doing a really good job and they're applying really sound economics, that will change a lot of institutions' assessments of how creditworthy they are, and will make it easier to lend to them. So in that way, yes, the IMF again plays this unique role that everybody else does sort of look at. But whether we should all talk to the fund rather than the World Bank or other multilateral development banks, I think it really depends on what you're working on and your country context and your local context, right? So if you're working, you might be working with a community that where, if you're an education NGO, or if you are an NGO that focuses on violence against women, for example, the IMF might not be the most relevant group to you, just because of different opportunities that open with these institutions, and because the World Bank or another regional development bank might have a specific project that could go directly to what it is that you're working on. So again, I wouldn't advertise that everybody should go talk to the IMF. It's about understanding what they do so that you can apply that to your own objectives, your own theory of change, your own work in your own context, and then you can try to engage in this sort of complex environment of international institutions. But it's good to understand how that system and how that environment works, right? So that when your governments do keep cutting public services over and over and over again, and you see the impacts of that on women's lives in the context that you work in, you understand that might not be just some government individual, some public official in your country making that decision. A lot of times these decisions are coming from other places, especially Washington, where the IMF and World Bank are, especially, I would say, for the MENA region, that's true. And so, if you're interested in changing those policies, understanding where some of them are coming from and how to influence that, is an important part of the puzzle. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Emma. Shereen, any last words?
يس في الحقيقة أنا بضيف لكلام إيما وبأمن عليه جدا جدا وبحط تحتيه خطوط عريضة كتير جدا لأهميته، لكن كمان بالنسبة للكونتكست اللي احنا بنشتغل عليه في المنطقة أو في تونس مهم كل المؤسسات اللي بتشتغل على حقوق اجتماعية اقتصادية، حق التعليم، حق السكن إلى آخره، تحط نصب عينيها صندوق النقد الدولي، لأنه في الوقت الجاي كمان في تونس تحديدا دول كتير في المنطقة يعني هو له باع وذراع طويل جدا وكبير جدا جدا في اللي بيحصل لنا على الأرض في اليومي. أنا أم وعندي طفلة محتاجة تتعلم بشكل جيد، محتاجة يبقى في سيرفيسز صحية جيدة علشان تقدر تكبر وتعيش بشكل يعني عادل، بشكل عادل. احنا مش طالبين غير العدالة، عادل، just development تنمية عادلة. علشان ده يحصل، علشان وانا بتكلم في حق التعليم والصحة وحقها كطفل، كل دول ريليتد. وفي الحقيقة صندوق النقد بيتدخل بشكل كبير وله باع كبير جدا جدا في السياسات وفي الاقتطاعات اللي بيتم يعني تحصيلها من ميزانيات التعليم والصحة، اللي هي أهم الميزانيات اللي المفروض تكون مثلا يعني من سياسات وبرامج كتير يتم تطبيقها. وايوه في الحقيقه المؤسسات التمويليه الكبرى الاخرى بتفولو ذا ليد، بتفولو الاي ام اف. ده ما بيعفيهاش من هم مش باص وهم تابعين، لا خالص، وفقا للسياسات ووفقا لسياساتهم الخاصه وخصوصا انه مثلا المؤسسات التمويليه الاوروبيه مختلفه عن مؤسسات الورلد بانك في بعض الاشياء مش كلها. الافريكان ديفلوبمنت بانك كمان عنده، انما الاي ام اف هو اللي بيحط الترندز وهو بيحط المعايير، مش هنقدر ننكر. بس شكرا.
شكرا شيرين. Thank you so much Emma, and thank you everyone who attended and who stayed with us until the last minute. I think we have so much to go home with from this session, and I think we can still build on the work that the Arab Watch Coalition and join them in what they are doing. And I'm very, very eager, Shereen, to receive all the information that you have about the upcoming training and the meeting that you will have in December in Tunis, so we can circulate them among our partners and we can attend also in person. And thank you so much, Emma, for giving us this very comprehensive overview of the international financial institutions at the global level. And we are also very eager to follow up with this work. And I think we are here for the long run to work on feminist economics in general. Just one last thing, we have our very last webinar coming on the 1st of December that will be on the fiscal policy and human rights as a framework for influencing fiscal policy, legal framework, opportunities and limitations. And this webinar will be given by the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And I hope you will be there as well. Hope you enjoyed this webinar, and let me know, you have my email, I'll type it again here. Let me know if you have any feedback, if you want to do anything related to this, and we are here to really network and take this forward. Thank you so much, Rabeb, for all your hard work and all the efforts you've been doing since the beginning of this series. And I wish you a very nice evening and a very good weekend. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, Sama.
Thank you, Sama. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Shereen. Speak soon.
Speak soon.
Bye.